This is the story of a scholar and advocate who has dedicated his life to justice and understanding. After earning his law degree from the University of San Francisco in 1974, he became a leading voice on immigration rights, civil rights, and social equity. He has taught at multiple universities, shaping generations of students to think critically about law and society. This is the story of Bill Ong Hing, a lawyer, educator, and author whose career demonstrates the power of activism in pursuit of a more just world. Mr. Hing, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation.
So, what sparked your initial interest in law?
Well, that's a good question. Honestly, part of it was an older brother who was a lawyer, 15 years older than me, who did basic basic law, and he got his name in the paper a couple times for representing some folks who were being accused of wrongdoing. And so that's one thing. But also, a lot of it had to do with community that I had the opportunity to go to college and to go to law school. And that gives one a certain amount of privilege. And so I felt like uh, that's a good way to give back is by offering what I've learned back to the community.
Now, was there a specific moment where you knew that you had to go into law?
Actually, part of it is going to sound like a joke. I started out as pre-med, and so after I didn't do that well in biology and organic chemistry, then I figured, you know what, I'm going to have to shift gears if I'm going to get into some. I'm not going to get into medical school, um, and that's part of it. But honestly, I think it has more to do with the fact that I realize that there are folks out there that don't have as much opportunity as I do and not as many resources. And I felt that the law was a path towards helping folks that are underserved.
Now, just for the audience to know, could you please explain a little bit about your personal upbringing as a child?
Sure, I'm the youngest of 10, actually, come from a big family. And I grew up in the middle of nowhere in a place called Superior, Arizona, which is about 60 miles southeast of Phoenix, Arizona, in a small copper mining town. And my parents had a small grocery store, and I worked in the grocery store as a kid and after school. Um, and even though it was a small town at that time, probably about 5,000 people, I would say that more than half of the community was Mexican American. And so to this day, I still have friends that I grew up with as a kid that I text with and I see whenever I go back to Arizona. And it was great. I played Little League Baseball growing up. I I was active in school in clubs. The My parents were very, very well loved in the community. They There was a copper mining town, as I said, and so there was a very active union, and they were the union and miners were union members and miners and their families were very loyal customers of my parents, in part because as I was growing up, there were at least two long strikes that the union members had, and so they didn't have money to pay for their groceries. But my parents didn't ever turn anyone away. They um, they gave people credit. They just gave them the food, and my parents went into debt also. But when both strikes were settled, they got out every penny back. There, all the customers were thankful, and pay them back. And so that made an impression on me. And that my parents did well enough that they uh, bought different property lots throughout our hometown, and they donated the land for a new baseball field for the Little League. They donated the land for a community swimming pool. There was no swimming pool in our hometown until my parents donated the money for that, and so the land for that, and so it was a good upbringing because it was diverse, uh, and I really benefited from that background, I think, and so I enjoyed that childhood.
Now, just to clarify, were your parents the first in your family to immigrate here to the United States?
Yes and no, and the reason I say yes and no is my father's immigration history is different than my mother's. Um, my father immigrated to the United States at the age of 15. Um, and he came as a young boy through San Francisco, Angel Island. He was detained there for 3 months and got out. Whereas my mother actually was born, my father was born in southern China in what we call Guangzhou, which is southern China, right outside of Hong Kong. My mother was also born in that area. I'm sorry, my mother's parents were also from that area, but my mother was actually born in Scranton, Pennsylvania in 1901. So she actually was not an immigrant. She was a US citizen by virtue of birth in Scranton, Pennsylvania. But when she was a little girl, her mother took her back to China to take care of her own mother. So that would be my mother's grandmother. And so my mother didn't return to the United States until she was in her 20s after my father went back to China to find a wife and through an arranged not an arranged marriage but through an introduction through a marriage broker who my father met many different candidates. Uh, he liked my mother and they got married. And after that, then my mother came back to the United States in the 1920s.
Well, that's a very interesting story. When you went to college, did you expect to return to your town when you were finished?
That's also a very good question. I don't think I ever expected to return to my hometown, but I did expect to return to Arizona. Um, by then, my brother had been practicing in Phoenix, and so that was in the back of my mind. And I probably had a conversation with my brother when I started law school. I came to college at Berkeley, um, and then, as you said in your introduction, after college, I went to law school in San Francisco, and so when I moved to the Bay Area to go to college, yeah, it was definitely in the back of my mind that I would go back to Arizona. But a funny thing happened on the way to the rest of my life, and that's that I met my future wife in college. And so my wife and I actually met when at the end of my sophomore year and the end of her junior year, and so we started dating, and she's from San Francisco, and she's the type of person that would always want to live in San Francisco and not move to Arizona. So that kind of the return to Arizona kind of dissipated from my mind by that time.
After you finished law school, what were the first years on your own like?
Okay, so to answer that question, I actually have to tell you about law school. So when I was in law school, after my first year of law school, as most people know, most law school uh, experiences involve 3 years. And after my first year, I volunteered in San Francisco, Chinatown, at two agencies. One was the YMCA. I volunteered as a college uh, counselor, not as a college, as a camp counselor. Um, that was after my first year of law school, but I also volunteered at a local legal aid office in Chinatown called San Francisco Neighborhood Legal Assistance Foundation. And I really loved both of those experiences. The camp counselor thing was working with immigrant kids, um, and I played the guitar, and we would I would teach them uh, folk songs, American folk songs, that kind of stuff. And so that was a lot of fun. And but I also had a great time volunteering at the legal aid office in Chinatown because they were representing families and all different sorts of challenges, from landlord tenant problems to consumer problems to public assistance problems to people losing their driver's licenses for different things. And it was a great feeling being able to help those folks. And I tell students that the most important class in law school actually is legal research and writing, because you learn, if you're good at legal research and writing, you can look up the answers to questions pretty quickly, or at least have a good guess. And I was able to apply that skill as soon as the first summer after the first year of law school. And so that was very, very rewarding. So I continued to volunteer at that office the second and third years of law school. And so my aspiration by then was to work in that office. And so I was very lucky that I got a job in that office. And so that's why when you ask me what my first couple of years out of law school were like, uh, that gives you the context of why I was at that office, because I really loved working there. The hitch was that what I wanted to do after law school was do housing law to represent low income tenants who were being treated unfairly by their landlords, not providing adequate facilities, not fixing things on time, uh, unnecessary rent raises, that kind of stuff. That's what I really wanted to do, but there was no opening for that position. What there was, however, was an opening for immigration law. And I had, although I had taken immigration law in law school, really, I didn't do immigration law as a law student, but they offered me the job. And so I accepted because I wanted to be in that office. And so the first couple of years was learning on the job. And fortunately, the previous attorney who held that position went into private practice in Chinatown, and he was always available to me to answer questions. And I met other, slowly but surely, I met other experienced immigration lawyers in San Francisco, and they were all very friendly and willing to mentor me. And so the first couple of years was a learning experience, but again, very rewarding. I was learning in an entirely different field, and it was a lot of stress and pressure, but also I felt that I could do the job. And so it was tough, but I survived.
So it sounds like you really enjoyed this experience of working in immigration law. Is that correct?
I enjoyed it because there was immediately a bad guy that I could fight against. And that bad guy was the Immigration and Naturalization Service. From the very beginning, I realized how evil some of the employees were at what used to be called the Immigration and Naturalization Service. And now it's got different names. It's ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, and or CIS, Citizenship and Immigration Services. Um, and I enjoyed it because I'm willing to take on bad guys who exploit or treat people meanly. and and I was pretty successful at it, and so it was rewarding in that sense. So yeah, I enjoyed it.
Could you please explain in specific what these evil organizations did?
For example, this example actually happened when I was a law student. Um, Although I didn't do immigration law, we had this tenant client who happened to be a Spanish speaker, and I speak a little bit of Spanish because of where I grew up, and and so the attorney representing him, representing this client, had me interpret for him for the landlord-tenant case. And that was all resolved, fortunately for that tenant client. But one day when he came in to actually accept a check that the landlord was forced to write to the tenant to pay back for some unconscionable charges, the client actually was not that happy. And and I said, gosh, this is a pretty good resolution of your case. And he said, no, 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 it's not. I'm happy about what you did, what your office did for me against the landlord. But I just got back from the immigration service before I came to your office, and somebody there ripped up my green card. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, well, I went down there because I wanted to find out how I could file an application for my wife to join me in the United States. But when I went down there, they sent me to an investigator, and the investigator looked at my green card and he thought it was fake. And he looked at it and he cut it with a pair of scissors. And then he said, oh, it's not fake. Sorry. And he just threw the two pieces back to the client. And I didn't know any better. When I heard that story, I said, this is outrageous. This is crazy. Let's go there. And without even talking to the attorney in the office, it was only about 6 blocks away from our legal aid office. And so we walked down there and I said, do you remember where the investigators? Yeah, he says up on the seventh floor. And so we took the elevator up to the seventh floor. We knocked on this door, and it was a room with about 8 different desks where there were 8 different immigration officers. And the client pointed at that officer, and I walked over there and I confronted the officer, and I said, I'm from the San Francisco Neighborhood Legal Assistance Foundation, and this is our client. And he tells us that you just cut his green card in half, and that it was a mistake. And the officer said, yeah, yeah, that's true. I did that. And I said, well, what are you going to do about it? And he said, oh, just go down to room 100 and tell them that I sent you, and they'll take care of you. And I thought, wow, that's a victory. And so we went down there, and we realized that room 100 was the general information room where there was about 100 people waiting in line. And so we waited in line for over an hour. And I said, well, investigator so and so sent us down here and said that my client could apply for a new green card. And the person across the information desk said, oh, yeah, sure. Here's the application. It's an I-90. Just fill it out and pay the $25 fee, and he'll get a new one in about 6 to 8 weeks. And so really, it was not the officer. It wasn't a victory. It was just the officer blowing us off and telling the guy to go apply for a new green card. And then when one of my first cases also involved a man from Eritrea, which, as your listeners may know, it borders on Ethiopia. And he was a young college student who was going to college in Fresno, California, which is in the Central Valley. But he had been diagnosed with a heart disease that uh, was, it made him breathless if he was at any location that was elevated. And while we don't think of Fresno as being a particularly elevated town, it's not at sea level. And so even that amount of elevation put pressure on his heart. So instead of continuing his classes in Fresno, he started taking classes at San Francisco State University, which is in San Francisco, and San Francisco is at sea level. And so his life and his heart was much more comfortable at that point. And but he was referred to me by an office called International Institute saying, oh, he needs to change, get permission to change his student visa from Fresno State to San Francisco State. And so we put in an application for change of status, and it was denied um, because he started taking classes before he got official permission to transfer. So I filed an appeal of that denial, and I'll never forget this denial letter. The denial letter was, and I submitted all the medical evidence and that type of thing. And so uh, I can't, I'll never forget this denial letter. It was, no, your appeal is denied because he started taking classes in a different university without permission. And we read the medical evidence, and if elevation is a problem, then we advise your client to take a boat back to Ethiopia, to back to Eritrea. That was the response. And yeah, I mean, that's just the kind of attitude that these folks have.
Well, that sounds like you said outrageous. How did you feel when you realized what was going on in both of these cases?
Well, completely frustrated, but it gave me more determination to fight harder for folks. I mean, fortunately, for neither one of those individuals, it was a matter of life and death. Although, for the student who could no longer go to school in the United States, it probably changed his life, of course, right? Um, but but yeah, it gave me more determination, especially on behalf of future clients and clients that I continue to represent, where it is a matter of life and death, uh, whether or not they're allowed to stay in the United States.
How would you handle situations like these right now, like hypothetically, with your new experience?
Well, the truth is that there was very little that could be done differently in both of the examples that I gave you, because the government has so much power, so much discretion on the part of individuals who they're denying visas, or they're doing something that might be viewed reasonable. Now, the foreign student, what I would advise him is to return and reapply for a new visa, and he probably would get it. And as I recall, that is actually what that student did. He did return home, and then he came back eventually. But just the aggravation of and the inconvenience of having to go through that. Um, but to answer your question, there's not always a perfect solution for many of the clients.
Did you ever consider running for like a public office so that you could personally write the laws and change them yourself?
No, never, because I just don't like the taste of politics. There are many members of Congress. In fact, I have a former law student who's a member of Congress from New Mexico. I have a former student who's in the state senate of California and the state senate of Arizona. Uh, I have a former student who's on this city council of San Jose. So and of course I know many politicians, and the they spend so much time having to raise money because in your public office, part of what you need to do is raise money for the next election, and the politics running for office is very expensive in the United States, and so no, the way I look at it is that I have access. I've had access to different members of Congress, and I get my ideas in front of them. And with some success over the years, there's been at least two or three things that I've been able to get implemented through legal changes, but not the big ideas. And um, so no, it's in my lifetime, uh, I would say I would say the most immigration laws that have been enacted have been disappointing, and only a couple of them have been big and helpful. And so, yeah, I think that politics is a strange animal as we see it today. That Congress doesn't get anything done.
Now, moving ahead a few years, in 1979, you founded the Immigration Legal Resource Center in San Francisco. What motivated to found your own resource center instead of continuing to work for someone else's?
So when I in 1979 was a kind of a pivoting point for me uh, in my career. I was a legal aid attorney from 1974 to 1979, and I did teach part-time in evening programs during that time as well. Uh, but I did want to become a full-time law professor, and I was very fortunate that I was offered a full-time law professor uh, position at a local law school in San Francisco that no longer exists. Actually, it's called Golden Gate University Law School. And those 5 years that I was at legal aid, uh, rightly or wrongly, many community organizations came to rely on me. They would constantly call me for advice when they had people come into their office who weren't sure what they could do with their immigration questions, and they would refer people to me, but mostly they would ask me questions. And so when I became a full-time law professor, they continued to do that. People continued to call me. And of course, I would answer. And I realized that there was actually a need for a support center, an entity that could be more than me, that to answer questions for other agencies that were frontline service providers. And uh, so that's when I had this idea. I had two ideas. One, as a law professor, I could still represent people and have students help me. And so I started the first law school immigration clinic in the country at Golden Gate Law School. Um, and at the time, I also recruited some volunteer attorneys to help me answer questions of the community organizations. Some of my mentors, I recruited them to help answer questions. And so putting two and two together, eventually I incorporated that idea into a nonprofit corporation. And that's what became the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. And it was basically doing casework through a law school clinic, but mostly doing training and providing information to agencies that needed help, that needed guidance on how to represent their clients.
Can you think of a specific moment during this time where your assumptions on law or justice in the United States were significantly challenged or altered?
Wow. Yeah, so in the 1980s, there were a lot of Guatemalans, El Salvadorans, and Nicaraguans that were fleeing civil wars in those three countries, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And they were coming here. And so my clinics and many of my friends began representing uh, countless numbers, hundreds of them applying for asylum who came to Northern California. And we thought they had good cases because they were caught in the middle of conflict and uh, they people couldn't live in safety in those countries. And but what we saw was a pattern of denials of asylum for Guatemalans and El Salvadorans, um, and approvals primarily for Nicaraguans. Uh, and what we realized is there was discrimination going on by the agency, and at the same time across the country, the same. I wasn't representing Haitians, but at the same time across the country, immigration authorities were denying asylum applications to Haitians as well. And so it took several lawsuits. I wasn't party to those lawsuits, but I provided information to the litigators to prove that the government was discriminating against Guatemalans, El Salvadorans, and Haitians. And so that was uh, mind blowing to me that the government could be so blatant in its misapplication of what should be a fair law, namely an asylum statute that's meant to be humanitarian. And so, but I learned at that time that politics is going to influence how decisions are made. And so that eye-opening experience is what has informed me and continues to inform me.
Based on what you just said, I have two questions for you. The first one is why would the government choose Nicaraguans over those other groups? What made Nicaraguans different?
Very good question. It's geopolitics. The the who was the person running the country of Nicaragua at that time was viewed as a leftist, perhaps sympathizer with the Soviet Union, with Russia, and Daniel Ortega, who has a long history. He was a president then, he's a president now, he wasn't a president. Anyway, the long story short is the United States did not want to align with him. And so anyone applying for asylum from his country, the United States would want to say, oh, yeah, they're going to be persecuted by this evil government. And so that's why they were granting asylum there. Whereas, in contrast, US was aligned with the right wing leaders of Guatemala and El Salvador. And, and we wanted to support those governments. And so those people who were who were challenging the right wing government there, we didn't want to say that they were going to be persecuted because we supported those governments, and it's really a shame, because if you look at the history of both El Salvador and Guatemala, the CIA actually supported those governments as well and supported right wing paramilitary groups, especially in El Salvador. And the government and the right-wing paramilitary groups that the U.S. helped to fund, they committed some atrocities, including the murders of Catholic priests and nuns. And that's all come out since then, since the 1980s, that we supported um, people who committed human rights violations. But that's the reason. It's because of geopolitics.
Well, this leads me to believe that asylum seekers from the other countries you mentioned, El Salvador, Honduras, and Haiti, they would be more likely to be accepted by left-leaning communist countries. Is that correct?
That is partly correct. And so we do see, for example, I wouldn't necessarily call them left-leaning, but we do see that Mexico, for example, and even Canada, they're more open to asylum applicants today from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador than the United States is, for sure.
And why do you think the United States has such different policies from Mexico and Canada?
I think that it's because the United States, and I think this is partly true for Democrats as well as Trump, um, doesn't want to be the sole, doesn't want to take sole responsibility for refugees in this region, and so even President Biden re-implemented many of the things that the first Trump administration did when it came to enforcement of the southern border. And I think it has every bit to do with that. The Democrats have the narrative of what's happening at the southern border is such that, which I think the narrative began mostly with the Trump administration, uh, that the Democrats have either bought into that narrative or they understand that the American public has bought that narrative. And so Democrats feel that they also have to be viewed as tough on the border and tough against asylum applicants. And to me, it's all political.
Now, a few years after you founded your legal center, you served as co-counsel in INS versus Cardoza. So,
Second, yeah.
so a few years after you started and founded your legal center in San Francisco, you served as co-counsel in a Supreme Court case in 1987. Can you please share your experience with that?
Yeah, that case was INS versus Cardoso Fonseca. And um, it was a woman who, ironically, was one of the few denials of an asylum applicant from Nicaragua. And it was in 1980, there was a new asylum law that went into effect. And Congress adopted language that if you have a well-founded fear of persecution, you should be granted asylum. But nobody knew exactly what well-founded fear meant. And so her case presented an opportunity to convince the Supreme Court that well-founded fear of persecution should not be too burdensome, that the asylum statute is meant to be humanitarian. It's meant to be generous. And I'm happy to say that there were four of us who represented her before the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court agreed with us that asylum is meant to be passionate, uh, compassionate. Asylum is meant to be generous. Asylum is a humanitarian statute. And so the Supreme Court said that you don't have to show to get asylum, you don't have to show that it's more likely than not that you're going to be deported. So let me repeat that. You don't have to show that it's more likely than not that you're going to be deported. You just have to show that there's a reasonable possibility that you might be persecuted. Okay. You don't have to show, I may have missed out. You don't have to show that it's more likely than not that you're going to be persecuted. You just have to show that there's a reasonable possibility of persecution. And they gave as an example that it's a reasonable possibility of persecution, even if there's just a 10% chance that you're going to be persecuted. Very, very generous, very, very deferential. And that is still the case law. That remains the case law. And so I'm very proud to have been part of that case because I think that we've helped to save some lives. I do think that some judges ignore that generosity sometime and they get away with it. But yeah, that was a big that was a big case.
And how did you get your start in that case? And how did it get its way all the way up to the Supreme Court?
Well, it's just one of those kind of things where I was at the right place at the right time. The woman who actually was representing Miss Luz Cordosa Fonseca uh, asked me to argue the case, to present the case at the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, the Federal Court of Appeals, because she was going on vacation, and the case was scheduled for oral argument at the Ninth Circuit, and she knew that I had won a couple of previous cases at the Ninth Circuit dealing with other issues. Um, and I so I said, sure, I would argue it for her. And so I argued it and we won the case at the Ninth Circuit. Uh, so I did it as a favor for her. And then the government appealed the case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court accepted the case. And so at that point, that attorney, whose name is Dana Marks, incidentally, she later became an immigration judge. Uh, so Dana Marks and I decided we should bring in a couple people to help us write the brief to the Supreme Court. And so she brought in one of her colleagues from their private law firm, a guy named Kip Steinberg. And I brought in my deputy at the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, Susan Leiden. And the four of us wrote the legal briefs and presented it to the Supreme Court, based a lot on international law, arguing that international law supports what we were arguing, that asylum should be humanitarian and generous. And Dana Marks is the one who actually argued the case at the Supreme Court, but the four of us are the ones who wrote the brief.
Now, I might be a bit confused, but how was the government able to appeal this case even though it had already been won for the victim? Isn't that an example of double jeopardy?
That's a very good question as well, because double jeopardy only applies in criminal cases. And deportation, asylum, immigration law is not considered criminal. It's all supposed to be what are called civil penalties. And because of that, the laws that apply to criminal law don't apply. So, for example, in criminal law, you have to prove that the person is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But in deportation, the government doesn't have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the person is deportable. They just have to prove that it's more that there's clear probability that the person is deportable. And so one of the manifestations of the fact that this is civil law rather than criminal law is that even if you win at a lower court, even if you win at trial, the government can still appeal in a deportation case. But that's not true in a criminal case. In a criminal case, if the person is found not guilty, then the government cannot appeal the not guilty plea. But that's not true in immigration law.
After this case, how did your career evolve during the rest of the 80s and the 90s?
Well, we continue to represent many people, and one thing that we did help push through in 1990, and I testified in front of Congress, was the implementation of something called temporary protected status, TPS, and so that is now part of the statute that if somebody is from a country where there is civil strife or even a hurricane or some devastating act, but it would include something like a civil war, that the president has the authority to grant temporary protected status to everybody in the United States who's from that country. And so over the years, TPS has been granted to people from, over 20 different countries. And the first example was El Salvador because of the conflict that I was telling you about, that TPS was granted by President Bush, actually, the first President Bush, uh, right after that law was passed. And so that happened. and then that was in 1990, and then in 1996, uh, uh, by that time I was teaching at Stanford, and I started an immigration clinic at Stanford, and then after that I got hired at UC Davis and ran the clinical programs, including the immigration clinic at at UC Davis, um, and I was commuting all that time from San Francisco to Stanford or San Francisco Davis. And finally, in the year 2010, I uh, was convinced to stop driving so much. And so I took a job at University of San Francisco, which is only a couple miles from where I live. And it's been much more convenient. And and then that's 2010 and 2015. I've continued to volunteer at the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, but in 2010, I decided to start a new clinic at University of San Francisco in 2015, actually 5 years after I started at USF, because uh, we realized that there were so many people fleeing Central America again, this time for different reasons. In the 1980s, it was mostly because of civil wars. Now it's mostly because of three things. It's mostly because of, well, I'm going to mention a fourth thing that most people don't mention, but the main three things are gang violence. The second is drug cartel violence, which is a little bit different. There's some overlap, but with gangs and cartels. And the third is domestic violence, that many of these countries have cultures of male dominance, and many women are trying to flee uh, domestic relations because of abuse. So we realized that a lot of people were fleeing because of that, and that there was a need for services. And so we started a clinic at the University of San Francisco, and it's basically a little legal aid office. And we have over 500 cases, and there's a staff of four attorneys headed by the person who is now the director of the Immigration and Deportation Defense Clinic. Her name is Jacqueline Brown. She's a brilliant asylum attorney and a great example to students and other attorneys on how hard she works. Um, and so that work is very, very important, and it's important for students and me, and it keeps us involved in the community. The other factor that I want to mention that drives people to migrate now is climate, and there's not enough talk about that. Um, but we're already seeing the effect of climate throughout the world, and people having to move, including from Central America, where agriculture is not the same even as it today as it was even 10 years ago. That land has dried up and people are not able to stay in agriculture. And so that's forcing people to move as well. And that's a new challenge that the world is going to have to deal with, is how to deal with climate migrants.
So I'm assuming climate migration is the hardest to prove. Um, is
It's
that correct?
impossible. It's impossible. You cannot win a case if you're claiming that the reason the person migrated because of climate. There's no area of law that recognizes it under US law or international law. Now, a little while ago, I alluded to TPS, temporary protected status. And so that's the thing that comes the closest. Uh, but that's usually for some major event, like a hurricane or an earthquake. And it would be difficult to send somebody back for a period of time. Um, and so there has been TPS granted in that respect, but then that's entirely up to the president, and uh, it's really uh, dependent on politics.
Are there any plans to change the law to allow climate and the environment to be a reason for asylum, to seek asylum.
No plans, unfortunately. Um, and I fear for your generation on so many levels when it comes to climate. Okay. One is the basic problem of climate change and the fact that most countries of the world are ignoring what needs to be done to address climate change. And climate migrants are, of course, a manifestation of that. And um, while there have been proposals introduced in the US Congress to recognize climate migrants, it's never gotten any traction. And the Trump administration, as your generation knows, even denies climate change. And so it's very disappointing that we backtrack so much in our obligations to the world on climate activism and climate leadership. And so we are a long way from, at least the US is a long way from addressing climate migration. There's talk in the United Nations on this issue, but again, um, without major countries like the United States, like countries of the European Union taking a leadership role, I don't see anything happening within the near future on climate migration.
Looking back on your career, what do you hope your lasting impact on immigration law, education, and the broader fight for social justice will be?
My main goal is to remind the public, my students, my friends, my neighbors, my relatives, that we are not talking about faceless individuals. We're talking about real people. So my main goal is to remind all of us that we have a heart and that the individuals and families that I've been representing, that countless of my friends and people who I consider my colleagues are working with are real people who have hearts, who have values, who have lives, and that we have to demonstrate humanity toward them. And that it's not only our duty and responsibility, but to me, it's what makes that work is what makes my life worth living. Uh, because we are privileged, and I want for the folks that I've met at the border, for the folks that I've met at detention centers, I want the same opportunities for them that my grandchildren have and that my friends and neighbors have. And those folks deserve no less.
Well, that is truly inspiring. This has been a great conversation. What do you wish to leave the audience with before we close?
Well, so we're recording this right now in the fall of 2025. And I'll be frank with your audience. We're at war. The uh, the immigrant community, including part of the community that is U.S. citizens, because many U.S. citizens have non-citizen relatives and live in mixed families. We're at war, and it's all hands on deck. That we should stand up, we should show up, um, we should show up at protests, we should help wherever we can, and volunteer, donate to immigrant rights organizations if you can spare some change, because I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. And so we're all in it together. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with the audience and I. It has been an honor to speak with you.
Thanks, John. Great job.
Thank you. Goodbye.